I froze the moment my grandfather looked across the dinner table and asked if I liked the villa he had given me, because I had never seen that place in my entire life. And my parents reacted like someone had just ripped open a secret they had buried for years. The room went quiet after that question. So quiet, I could hear the ticking of the kitchen clock over the Christmas music playing from a speaker in the corner. I sat there at the long hardwood table, surrounded by garlands and candles and food that smelled way better than anything my parents usually cooked. And for a second I thought I had misheard him. Maybe Harrison had mixed me up with one of my cousins, or maybe he was joking in that dry way older men sometimes do. But then he leaned forward with that bright, proud smile he had carried in with him and asked again if I truly liked living here. I felt the confusion crawl up from my stomach to my throat. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out at first. My eyes shifted to my dad, Gregory, who suddenly looked like he was gripping his wine glass too hard. Linda was sitting beside him, stiff as if she had been carved out of ice. Brandon was still chewing, pretending not to notice any of it. I cleared my throat and tried to steady my voice. "It is a beautiful house, Grandpa. I just did not know it was supposed to be mine." As soon as I said that, something heavy dropped into the atmosphere. You could almost hear the air being sucked out of the room. Harrison turned his head slowly, the smile fading until nothing but concern remained. He was 72, but built like he was still in his late 50s. And when he straightened up in his chair, he looked bigger, sharper, more alert. "What do you mean you did not know it was yours?" "Lucas." He asked this slowly, like each word had weight he needed me to confirm. I remembered feeling my pulse hammering in my neck, but I tried to keep my tone calm. "I do not live here. I never have. This is Dad and Linda's place. I rent an apartment over on South Canal. I guess I thought you knew." I watched his face change, and my stomach tightened. His brows lowered a little. Not in anger yet, but in a kind of deep hurt that told me he suspected something far uglier than a misunderstanding. He looked at my father first, and I saw him hesitate like a man cornered. My dad looked straight at the tablecloth. Not at his father, not at me, not at anyone. Linda reached for her glass and missed it slightly, her hands shaking before she grabbed onto the stem. I knew then that whatever was happening was not an accident. I just did not know how deep it went. Harrison pushed his chair back with a long scrape against the floor, stood up, and stepped behind my chair. He rested a hand on my shoulder with a kind of protective weight that made my chest tighten. "Lucas, tell me where you live again." He did not sound confused anymore. He sounded suspicious. I swallowed. "I live in a studio apartment above a laundromat. It is nothing special, but it is what I can afford. I work at a hardware store part-time. I go to school when I can. This house is not mine." Linda let out a sharp laugh she tried to turn into a cough. "Will, this is just a misunderstanding. Lucas likes being independent. He has always been like that. It is important he learns to handle life on his own. Right, Lucas?" Her eyes cut toward me like a warning. They had that same edge I had known since I was a kid. The kind that told me not to embarrass the family, not to push too hard, not to challenge the story they wanted everyone else to believe. I felt something shift inside me, like a hinge locking into place. I sat up straighter and shook my head. "No, that is not true. I never chose to live away from them. That has never been the story here." She froze. My father finally looked up, eyes wide with something between fear and anger. But he did not say a word. Not one word. Harrison exhaled through his nose, long and slow. Then he circled the table until he stood beside my father. "Greg." His voice was low but steady. Why does my grandson live in a rented apartment while you and your family live in a villa I never intended for you? Gregory blinked fast, his jaw working as if he had forgotten how to form words. Finally, he managed. Dad, I think you are misunderstanding what happened. Misunderstanding? Harrison repeated it quietly, as if testing how the word tasted when it came from a liar. Linda cut in again, too quickly. This villa belongs to the whole family. There is no reason to split hairs about it. We all share this home. That has always been the plan. Her voice cracked on the last word. She knew it. We all knew it. Harrison did not even look at her. He kept his focus pinned on my father. And for the first time in my life, I saw my dad shrink under someone else's gaze. My father had always been the one who made other people feel small. Seeing him try to melt into the chair was something I never expected. Lucas. Harrison said my name again and turned back to me. Did they ever tell you about any gift I planned for you? Any property? Any home? I shook my head. No, never. I thought you just wanted to have Christmas dinner. The next second, Harrison's expression hardened into something I had never seen on him. It was the look of a man who had just realized he had been betrayed by the people he trusted most. He placed both hands on the table and leaned forward. Greg, you will explain this. Now, my father's throat bobbed. He looked at my mother-in-law. She looked at him. Brandon stared at his plate like the mashed potatoes might save him. I waited. I do not know what I expected. Maybe a denial. Maybe an apology. Maybe some thin excuse about paperwork or confusion. What I did not expect was complete silence. I felt something simmer through my chest. Something like anger, but deeper, older. Something that had been waiting years for this moment. I realized then how many times I had let this family shape me into someone who stayed quiet. Someone who made himself small. Not tonight. I pushed back my chair and stood up. My hands were shaking, but my voice was steady. Grandpa, I do not know what Dad and Linda told you, but I promise you this. None of what is happening here has anything to do with me choosing independence. I have been on my own because that was the only option they ever gave me. No one spoke. Not even the house itself seemed to make a sound. Harrison straightened and nodded. Not at them, but at me. It was a subtle gesture, but I felt something settle inside my chest for the first time in a long time. A recognition. A validation I had always wanted, but never received from my own father. I looked back at Gregory, hoping he might at least meet my eyes. He did not. He stayed staring at the table, like the truth laid out there might swallow him whole. And that is how the night began. The one where everything they had tried to hide for years finally started to crack open. The one where for the first time, I stopped being the quiet son who kept his head down and started becoming someone else entirely. Someone who was finally ready to know the truth. The moment hung there between us, heavy and waiting, as if the walls themselves knew what was coming next. But none of us were ready to face it. I felt the weight of that silence lingering in my chest long after the words were spoken. And standing there in that too-bright dining room pulled me backward in time in a way I could not stop, even if I wanted to. My earliest memories were never warm ones. They were quiet rooms, slammed doors, and the feeling of always trying to stay out of the way. I remember being 6 years old, sitting on the top step of the attic stairs, holding a toy truck missing one wheel. Brandon had the new ones. He always had the new ones. Linda had told me the old truck was good enough for me. She said kids like me did not need everything handed to us. I was too young to understand what kids like me meant, but old enough to feel the sting of it. There were nights when I would hear my father and Linda laughing downstairs after Brandon went to bed. I would sit on that attic mattress with springs that poked my back and wonder if they had simply forgotten I existed. Greg was never outright cruel, not in the way some men are. But he had a coldness in his voice that could make a kid feel like a burden just by breathing. When I brought home an A on a math test, he barely looked up from his newspaper. Not bad. Try to keep it up. Brandon brought home a C, and they took him out for pizza to celebrate the effort. I remember hearing their car pull out of the driveway and wondering what was wrong with me that I could do everything right and still be invisible. Sometimes Harrison called, though not often, because he lived in Chicago and was busy running his construction company. When he did call, his voice felt like sunlight through a dirty window. He would ask about school, about friends, about whether I wanted to visit him in the summer. I always said yes, even though I rarely got the chance. Those conversations were the only times I felt like someone older actually saw me. Growing up inside that house was like walking through fog. You could breathe, you could move, you could function, but everything felt just out of reach. Love, belonging, even fairness. There was a day when I was around 9 and Linda wanted a new family picture for the living room wall. She put Brandon in a button-down shirt and combed his hair. She handed me a shirt that was too big and told me not to wrinkle it. I remember Greg adjusting Brandon's collar and not even looking in my direction. When the photographer said, "Move a little closer together," Linda put her hand on my shoulder in a way that felt staged, too gentle to be real. I remember feeling like a prop in a photograph, meant to tell a story that had nothing to do with me. Those memories pressed on me now as I stood in the dining room, surrounded by people who had always known how to make me feel small. Linda finally spoke again, her voice low and tight like she was trying to regain control. "Lucas, no one wants to fight tonight. It is Christmas. We are supposed to enjoy this evening. Your grandfather did not come here to dig up confusion. Why do you always take things the wrong way?" Something sharp twisted in my chest. I had heard that line my whole life. Why do you take things the wrong way? As if the problem had always been me and not the things they had done. I did not answer her. I looked at Greg instead. He still could not meet my eyes. He had that look he used to get when a bill came in higher than expected, or when Brandon messed up and he needed someone else to take the blame. It was a look I had grown up with, one that made me feel responsible for problems I never caused. Harrison finally broke the silence. "Lucas, come sit with me for a moment." I did as he asked, moving to the living room where the tree lights flickered against the windows. He lowered himself onto the end of the couch with a sigh, rubbing his temples. "Tell me something. How long have you lived on your own?" I sat down across from him. Since I was 19, I had to. I worked to pay rent and classes. I paused, choosing my words carefully. They never helped me. He nodded slowly, as if that confirmed something he had suspected for a long time. "Your father told me you wanted independence, that you did not need the support, that you were proud of doing things on your own." A bitter laugh slipped from me before I could stop it. Proud. I lived in a one-room studio with a leaky radiator and roaches behind the breaker panel. I worked double shifts to keep the lights on. Proud had nothing to do with it. It was survive or fall apart. His jaw tightened. I could see it. The moment a line from my childhood flashed through his mind too. "You are lucky to have a roof over your head. Brandon needs the room downstairs. You are old enough to manage the attic." I never forgot that day. Greg walked into the living room at that moment like he had been drawn by the sound of his name being spoken in a tone he had never heard from his father before. He stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, shoulders squaring as he tried to prepare his defense. "Dad, this is getting out of hand. There is no need to dramatize things. Lucas has always been emotional. He never understood how much we tried to do for him. Linda stepped beside him, arms folded. Yes, that is exactly right. He always made things more difficult than they needed to be. I stared at them. Those words were familiar too, almost like they were part of a script they had rehearsed for years. Every time I questioned something, every time I stood up for myself, every time I asked why, I was the one who misunderstood, who complicated things, who saw problems where none existed. Harrison leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and looked at Greg with a steadiness that made even Linda take a step back. Let me ask you plainly, why is my grandson living in poverty when you live in a villa I provided? Greg opened his mouth, but nothing came out. I waited for it. The excuse about money being tight for a while, or the villa being better suited for a family, or anything that could soften the truth. But my father had run out of lies. I could see it in the way his jaw clenched, in the way he kept shifting his weight like the floor under him had turned unsteady. I felt a faint tremor under my ribs, a mix of old hurt and something new. Anger, the kind of anger that builds over years of being quietly erased. I stood again. I could not sit anymore. I needed to be on my feet for whatever came next. For years I had carried this feeling that something about the way they treated me was not just cold, but intentional. Now that possibility stood right in front of me, no longer hiding behind polite smiles or practiced lines. Before anyone spoke again, the timer on the oven beeped from the kitchen. A sharp sound that cut through the tension without resolving a thing. Linda jumped at the noise and hurried to turn it off, grateful for the excuse to step out of the room. Greg followed her with a half step, then stopped. Still unable to decide whether to run or stay, Harrison did not move. His eyes stayed locked on my father, the silence between them heavier than anything said so far. I looked through the doorway toward the dining table where the untouched plates of Christmas dinner sat cooling. The golden lights, the wreaths, the candles, all of it felt like a set built around a lie. And I realized this was only the beginning of whatever truth was about to surface. The truth had been circling us all night, and the longer we stood in that living room, the more I felt it tightening around my throat, so sharp it almost hurt to breathe. I turned away from the dining table and walked toward the window, needing some kind of distance, even if it was only a few steps. Outside the glass, Christmas lights blinked along the roof lines of neighboring houses, peaceful and bright, completely unaware of the wreck inside ours. Earlier that year, before any of this, I had stood on another porch in this same neighborhood, holding a bottle of cheap red wine and a small embroidered handkerchief I had saved 3 weeks to pay for. I had been invited to the housewarming party for this villa, though no one in my family had mentioned a move until the text came from Linda. For a few minutes, I sat in my car rehearsing something simple to say. Congratulations on the new place. Hope you are all settling in. I wanted it to feel normal, like maybe things were turning a corner. Deep down, I think I wanted to believe there was still space for me in their lives, even if it was small. When I finally knocked that night, Linda opened the door in a silk dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She smiled at me in the way someone smiles at a coworker they barely tolerate. "Oh, good. You made it. Come in." Her hand hovered near my back but never touched it, like even the gesture was too much effort. I stepped inside and felt my breath catch. The place did not look anything like the house I grew up in. The floors gleamed, the kind of shine that comes from brand new wood that has never seen a spilled drink or a dragged chair. The fireplace was stone-framed and massive, like something out of a catalog. Family portraits lined the staircase. Greg and Linda on their wedding day, Brandon holding a basketball trophy, Brandon at a science fair, Brandon with the dog they bought for him when he was 10. I scanned them slowly and counted. Not one picture included me. I remember gripping the wine bottle a little too tight. Linda took it from my hands and set it on the kitchen counter without looking at it. Greg stood at the stove opening another bottle, the good kind. The kind that costs more than I earned in half a shift. He saw me and gave that stiff nod he always used as a substitute for affection. He did not ask how I was. He did not ask about school or work or life. He just said, "You are here." Then he turned back to whatever he was cooking. There were a few guests already seated in the living room. Neighbors and colleagues of his from the insurance office. They spoke loudly and easily, talking about renovations and property values, and how lucky Greg had been to find such a place just before the market spiked. Every word felt like a pin sliding into my skin. Lucky, smart, sharp negotiator, a man who knew opportunities. I sat on the far side of the room and tried to blend in. No one asked me who I was. I watched Linda laugh with the neighbors, her voice buoyant with pride as she bragged about the granite countertops and the fenced yard and the built-in grill on the patio. She gestured around the room like she had earned every inch of it. It was wrong. I knew it even then, though I did not know why. Something about the whole house felt like it had been constructed out of lies. It was too polished, too staged, too carefully built into a perfect image. And the way they acted around me was the same. Every time a phone camera came out, Linda would motion for me to step closer, almost shoving me into frame beside Brandon. Greg would place a hand on Brandon's shoulder and lean in proudly while I stood on the edge of the photo trying to look like I belonged there. I did not. I knew it. They knew it. But somehow, they needed me in the picture. Later that night, right before I left, I remember standing alone in the hallway. The place was quiet for a moment, and the smell of wood polish filled the air. I studied one framed picture on the wall. It was the three of them sitting on the living room couch, smiling like some magazine family. The image was too perfect, too curated. Something in my chest twisted. What narrative were they trying to build? Back in the present, standing in that same house with the truth starting to bubble to the surface. All the unease from that night crashed into me again. I turned away from the window and faced the dining room, where Harrison had taken his place at the head of the table. His presence dominated the space, as if every ornament and candle bowed under it. Greg hovered beside his chair like he was afraid to sit, while Linda rearranged silverware that did not need rearranging. Brandon had disappeared down the hall, probably hiding behind a closed door like he used to do whenever things got tense. The weight of everything inside me, every memory of being sidelined, ignored, minimized, all of it tightened as I stepped closer to the table. The smell of roasted turkey that had been comforting when I walked in now made my stomach turn. Greg lowered himself into a chair at last, hands clasped in front of him. He cleared his throat and tried for a steady voice. "Dad, I think we need to calm down. This is a misunderstanding. Lucas was always independent. He never wanted our help. We did not want to interfere with his goals." I felt the words grip the back of my neck. That story again. The lie they had used to excuse everything. It made my voice sound colder than I expected when I finally responded. "That is not true. You never offered help. I took what I could get because that was all there was." Greg looked up at me with a flash of irritation. "Lucas, you do not understand how hard things were back then." I stepped closer. "Hard for you, harder for me. But that never mattered. Did it?" He opened his mouth again, but Harrison cut him off with a single sharp breath. "Enough. I have heard all I need from you tonight. What I want is the truth. Why is my grandson living alone in a half-broken apartment while you live in a villa you did not pay for? Linda returned from the kitchen holding a tray of rolls that none of us wanted. Her smile was tight and desperate. Will, can we not ruin dinner over this? It is Christmas. Can we please just enjoy tonight? Harrison stared at her in a way that made her set the tray down too quickly. One of the rolls rolled off the plate and hit the table with a soft thud. No one touched it. My heart was pounding again. Not with fear now, but with something like anticipation, or maybe dread. For years, something had felt off. Something had been kept from me. Something had been twisted to make me believe I deserved less. Now I could sense the truth sitting right behind us, waiting to break through. A truth built into the walls of this house, in every picture frame, every polished surface, every lie that held the place together, and I knew we were seconds away from hearing it. Harrison leaned forward in his chair, hands pressed flat against the table as if he needed to feel something solid beneath him. His voice came out low and controlled, but each word landed like a hammer. Greg, I sent you a wire transfer 2 years ago. $520,000. You told me you were purchasing a property for Lucas, a home, a start. So explain to me why I am standing in that home tonight and my grandson is not living in it. The words cracked through the room. Linda froze beside the tray of rolls. Greg's shoulders tightened, his spine rigid like a man bracing for impact. My heartbeat thudded in my ears as I took one slow step back. Not out of fear, but to get a better view of the scene I had waited years without knowing I was waiting for. Greg rubbed his forehead and let out a shaky breath. Dad, the situation was not so simple. You were dealing with surgery at the time. You were under stress. You might have misremembered the details. Harrison straightened. His voice sharpened. I misremembered transferring over $500,000. Greg's jaw clenched. He tried again. It was for the family. That was the understanding. It made sense for us to use the house. Lucas was doing fine on his own. He had a path. He did not need something this large. It would have been irresponsible to put such a burden on him. A burden. That word hit me harder than I expected. I felt heat flare in my chest. I stepped forward, my voice steadier than it should have been. A burden. You think a home would have been a burden for me? I paid rent working nights in a hardware store while going to school half-time. What burden are you talking about? Greg tried to give me the same look he used when I was younger, the one meant to shut me down. It did not work anymore. Lucas, you are being dramatic. Life is not as simple as you make it. Your brother needed stability. Brandon is younger. He is preparing for college. He needed a good home, good schools, good structure. You were already out of the house. I shook my head slowly. No, I was pushed out of the house. That is different, Linda snapped. She had held herself together as long as she could, and something inside her broke. She jabbed a finger toward me, her voice cracking with anger. You never appreciated what we did for you. Never. You were quiet, unresponsive, ungrateful, always sulking. You acted like a victim from the day I met you. You were not my responsibility. I tried, but you made everything difficult. She stopped, breathing hard. Her words echoed in my head like old ghosts. I had heard versions of them my entire childhood. Harrison turned to her with a look so cold she recoiled as if slapped. He said nothing to her. Instead, he turned fully toward Greg. So you took the house meant for my grandson. You signed the deed in your name. You furnished it. You moved into it. And then you staged photographs to convince me Lucas was living here. I felt my stomach drop. Staged. Photographs. It explained everything. The sudden pressure for me to be in family pictures. The fake warmth. The forced smiles. The way Linda adjusted my shirt collar like she had ever cared about details like that. Greg's face blanched. Dad, hold on. That was not intended to deceive. We just wanted to show unity. We wanted you to think the family was whole. Harrison's voice dropped. So you lied. Greg swallowed. It was not like that. So what was it like? Harrison's voice rose, filling the room. You let this boy starve for affection. You let him sleep under a leaking roof. You let him think he was unwanted while you lived in the home I worked my entire life to afford for him. No one breathed, not even me. I looked at Greg. Really looked. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in his eyes. Not the kind that comes from guilt, but the kind that comes from being exposed. I spoke quietly. Why did you do it? Why not tell me the truth? Why not tell me the money was there? Why let me think you could not afford to help me? Greg opened his mouth, but Linda answered instead, sharp and fast. Because you were not the one who needed it. Brandon was... He is our son. He is the future. He is the one who will carry this family forward. You were just... She stopped when she realized she had said too much. Her voice dropped. You were older. You could manage. Something inside me cracked open. I felt my hands curl into fists at my sides. I raised my head and looked right at her. Say it. You were about to say it. Say what I was to you. She looked away. That was enough. Harrison slammed his palm onto the table so hard, one of the candles flickered out. That is it. I am done listening to this. Lucas, go get whatever you brought here tonight. You are coming home with me. Greg shot up from his chair. Dad, wait. We can fix this. We can talk about this privately. There is no need to escalate things. Harrison turned on him. Escalate. You stole from your own son. You stole from me. You watched him struggle while you lived comfortably in his place. And now you want privacy? No. Not tonight. Greg's shoulders slumped. He looked at me, and for a split second I saw something almost human flicker through him. Shame. Maybe even regret. But it was too late. Years too late. Dad? His voice trembled. I thought I was doing what was best. For the family. I stared at him and felt a surprising calm settle over me. Best for the family. It was always that line. Always the excuse that justified every decision that left me behind. I answered him quietly. I was part of the family too. You just never treated me like it. His face crumpled. He had no words. Harrison placed a steady hand on my back. His voice softened when he spoke to me. You do not need to stay here another minute. We are leaving. I nodded. My chest felt heavy, but also lighter than it ever had. Like I had been carrying a weight for years and had finally set it down. I walked toward the door, passing the staircase with all the picture frames. Every one of them felt different now. They were not memories. They were evidence. Proof of a story created without me. A life built on top of the things I never had. At the entryway, I paused and looked back at the table. The lights. The people who had shaped me through their absence and neglect. Greg's hands were pressed against his forehead. Linda stood rigid, refusing to meet my eyes. Brandon peeked from the hallway, pale and confused. The first glimpse of fear I had ever seen on him. I took a slow breath and opened the front door. Cold air rushed into my lungs and hit me like a shock. Behind me, I heard Harrison say one final sentence to my father, in a tone that left no room for interpretation. I will make sure this house belongs to the right person. I stepped outside into the snow. The door shut behind me with a thud that sounded like the end of something long overdue. and for the first time in my life, I did not feel alone walking away. Snow crunched under my shoes as I followed Harrison down the walkway toward his SUV. The cold air burning my lungs in a way that felt strangely welcome. It shocked me awake, cleared out whatever fog had clung to my mind inside that house. The sky was dark, but the neighborhood glowed under strings of Christmas lights. Warm and peaceful in a way I had never felt in my own family's home. Harrison opened the back door of the SUV and gestured for me to get in. His driver, a man named Cole who had worked for him for years, nodded at me with a quiet understanding that made my chest tighten. The car door shut behind me, and for the first time all night, silence felt safe. Harrison settled into the seat beside me and rested his hand on my shoulder. "I am sorry you had to find out this way," he said. I could hear the guilt tucked beneath every word. I stared at my hands. I am not sure there was any good way to find out. He let out a slow breath. Maybe not. But it should not have been like this. Cole drove us towards the highway, the windshield wipers brushing away light flurries. Outside the window, the lights of the neighborhood blurred into streaks. I felt the distance growing between me and that villa, between me and everything inside it. Part of me expected to feel empty. Instead, I felt something else. Relief. Like escaping a trap I had never realized was fully closed around me until the moment I stepped out of it. We reached a downtown hotel near the river. Harrison had already reserved a room. He walked with me to the elevator and pressed the button for the 12th floor. The hum of the ride up felt surreal, a sharp contrast to the chaos we had left behind. When the doors opened, he handed me a key card. "This room is yours for tonight. Tomorrow you are coming with me to Chicago. We will get everything sorted from there." I hesitated. "Are you sure?" He gave me that same steady look I remembered from childhood, the kind that made me believe things might get better someday. I should have stepped in years ago. "Let me do right by you now." The words hit me deeper than I expected. It took me a moment to nod. Inside the room, I dropped my coat on the bed and sat down, feeling the mattress sink under me. I stared at the city lights through the window, my mind replaying everything, each moment sharper than the last. The questions cut into me like cold glass. Why did they do it? Why was I so easy to cast aside? Why had my father chosen silence every time I needed him to speak? Sleep came in restless waves. But at some point I drifted off, and by morning the fog had lifted enough for me to breathe again. Harrison knocked on my door at 7:30. He wore a dark coat and carried 2 coffees. "Come on," he said. "We have a plane to catch." At the airport, he moved with the confidence of someone used to traveling for business. I followed him through security, my mind still adjusting to the sudden shift in my life. On the plane, he opened a newspaper, but barely read it, looking at me instead as if checking whether I was holding together. Halfway through the flight, he lowered the paper. "There are some things you need to know before we reach Chicago." My stomach tensed. "Like what?" He leaned back in his seat. "Your mother had set up a fund for you before she passed. A small trust. It was meant for your education or your first home. Whatever you chose, it was not a huge amount, but enough to help you start your life. 150,000. I sent money regularly to keep it growing. Your father was in charge of managing it after she died." My breath caught mid-inhale. I felt the world tilt for a moment, not violently but slowly, like someone had taken the floor and shifted it a few degrees. "Did he—" I could not finish the sentence. Harrison nodded. "He used it. All of it. Years ago. He told me the money had gone into supporting you. Clothes, school, private tutoring. All the things he said you needed but could not afford. My chest tightened. I did not have private tutoring. I did not have new clothes. I wore shirts from clearance bins and fixed soles on my shoes with glue. I remember digging change out of my pockets to buy school lunch more than once. The anger that rose inside me was not loud. It was quiet, heavy, the kind that sits under your ribs and refuses to move. I stared ahead at the seat in front of me. Why did he do it? Harrison shook his head slowly. I had hoped he would tell you himself one day. I think losing your mother broke him in ways he never faced. But that does not excuse it. Nothing excuses it. I felt the plane descend, the pressure shifting around us. Chicago came into view beneath the clouds, a stretch of lake and towering buildings that looked nothing like Ohio. It felt like another world, far removed from everything I had grown up with. We landed and Cole picked us up in a black SUV. The city streets were alive even in the cold. People hurried along sidewalks, bundled in coats and scarves. The energy pulsed through me, waking something I had not felt in years. Possibility. We pulled up to Harrison's home in an upscale neighborhood lined with old trees and stone houses. It was more than a house. It was a mansion with an arched entryway, wide windows, and a long driveway lit by ground lights. I stepped out of the SUV and felt overwhelmed. I had never seen anything like it up close. Harrison smiled when he saw my reaction. Come inside. Everything that is mine is yours now. Inside the foyer, the air smelled faintly of cedar. A staircase swept upward to the second floor, and framed art hung on the walls. He walked me down a hallway and opened a door to a bedroom that looked larger than my entire apartment. A king-sized bed, a desk with a new laptop, a view of the backyard where the winter garden shimmered under frost. We can start fresh here, he said. No pressure, no expectations, just a clean slate. You tell me what you want, and I will help you build it. I swallowed hard. My voice felt tight. I do not even know what to say. You do not have to say anything, he answered. You just have to let yourself breathe. I set my bag on the floor and walked to the window. Outside, the sky hung low and gray, the first hint of snow beginning to fall. Through the glass, the world looked calm, steady, something I had never truly had before. I turned back to Harrison. I want to go to school. For real this time. Not part-time, not whenever I have money. I want to finish a degree. He nodded. Then we will make it happen. He left me in the room to unpack. I sat on the bed, feeling the softness of it give under my weight. My hands were sore from gripping the armrests on the plane. My mind was sore from everything else. But somewhere in the middle of that heaviness, there was a flicker, a breath, a beginning. I took one more look around that room, then down at my hands, and let myself imagine a life that did not start with survival. A life that maybe, for the first time, could start with hope. I woke the next morning to a quiet I was not used to. No footsteps on thin apartment floors, no neighbors slamming their doors, no pipes rattling. Instead, there was soft light coming through the curtains and the faint hum of heat moving through the vents. For a moment, I forgot where I was. When it hit me, the weight of everything from the night before gently settled on my chest. But it did not crush me this time. It just reminded me that life had changed. I showered and dressed, still getting used to clothes that did not come from clearance racks. When I stepped into the hallway, the scent of coffee drifted up from downstairs. I followed it into the kitchen where Harrison sat at the table reading something on his tablet. He looked up with a warm grin. Good morning. Did you sleep all right? Better than I expected, I said, pouring myself coffee. The mug felt nicer than anything I had owned before, but I tried not to think about that too much. He nodded at the chair across from him. Sit. We have a lot to talk about today. I sat down. He closed his tablet and folded his hands. I want you to know something before we move forward. None of this is charity. None of this is pity. You are my grandson. You deserve every good thing that comes your way. I want you to build your life the way you choose. I met his eyes and felt something tighten in my throat. Thank you. I do not know how to take all of this in yet, but I am trying. That is all I ask, he said. We talked through breakfast about the college options in Chicago, his company, and what I might want to study. I remembered wanting to be an engineer when I was younger, before I learned that dreams were expensive and hope was a luxury. Hearing him talk about possibilities made those old sparks flare again. Faint, but real. Later, he drove me to his construction company, a modern glass building downtown with busy people moving through the lobby. I had never stepped into a building like that, unless I was cleaning floors or delivering supplies. The security guard greeted Harrison by name and nodded at me like he already knew who I was. That felt strange. But I kept walking. We rode the elevator to the 6th floor. His office overlooked the river, wide windows framing a view that stretched for miles. He introduced me to his assistant, a woman named Karen who shook my hand with genuine warmth. Then he led me through the bullpen where teams worked over blueprints and screens filled with project layouts. People stopped what they were doing to greet him, and he proudly introduced me as his grandson. There was no sarcasm, no awkward glances, no sense that I was an outsider. It was the first time I realized what it felt like to be welcomed without conditions. He guided me to a small conference room. This is where you would start. Not anything heavy. Just learn the ropes. See what interests you. You can shadow some of our planners. Maybe sit with our project managers, if you want. I touched the back of one of the chairs, imagining myself sitting there as someone who belonged. I want to try. I think I need something like this. He smiled. I thought you might. As the day went on, he gave me a tour of a nearby construction site. Men in hard hats moved with practiced rhythm. Forklifts hummed. Metal clanged. Voices called back and forth. Dust filled the cold air, but everything felt alive. He showed me the plans for a new community center, walked me through the support beams and foundations, explained how each decision had a purpose. Seeing him in his element, confident and respected, made me feel proud in a way I had never felt about family before. By the time we returned home, my head was full and my legs were tired. I stepped into the kitchen for water and found a stack of mail on the counter. My name was on one envelope, written in handwriting I recognized immediately. I felt the cold slip through me. It was from my father. I stood there for a long moment before opening it. The letter was short, only half a page. Lucas, I hope you are well. I heard you left with your grandfather. I want to talk. I made mistakes. I know that now. Please call me. There was no apology, no explanation, no acknowledgement of what he had done. Just a request, a pulling of the same thread he had used my entire childhood. I folded the letter and slipped it into my pocket without saying anything. My appetite vanished, so I went upstairs and sat on the edge of my bed. The house was still and quiet. My thoughts were not. Part of me wanted to ignore the letter completely. Another part wanted to call him and demand answers. Why he had lied. Why he had let me struggle. Why he had let me believe he did not have money to help me go to school when he had taken everything meant for me. I thought I had exhausted every emotion toward him. But anger returned in a slow, steady burn, mixed with something else, sadness, grief for a father I had never really had. A soft knock came at my door. Harrison stepped inside. Everything all right? I nodded, but he saw through it immediately. Is that from your father? I pulled the letter out and handed it to him. He read it once and handed it back. "You do not owe him anything," he said. "Not a call, not an explanation, not forgiveness. Whatever you choose to do it because you want to, not because he guilted you into it." I let that sink in. "Do you think I should talk to him?" I asked. "I think you should protect your peace," he answered. "And your peace is not in Ohio anymore." I looked down at the letter again. My father's handwriting felt like a ghost reaching out. But I realized it no longer held the same power. Not like before. Not now. I crumpled it slowly in my hand and tossed it into the small trash bin near the desk. It felt like closing a door that had been left open for too many years. That night I sat at the window watching snow fall over the yard. I wondered if he would call next, or write again, or show up. I wondered if any part of me would want to talk to him someday. But tonight the answer was simple. I chose quiet. I chose distance. I chose this new life that was forming around me. Fragile but real. I rested my forehead against the cold glass and let my breath fog the window. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft and steady. Inside the room, I finally felt something settle inside me. A beginning had already started, and something else was ending for good. Winter settled deeper over Chicago in the days that followed. But inside the house, I felt something thawing. I spent mornings shadowing planners at the company, afternoons walking job sites with Harrison, and evenings studying college program guides he spread across the dining table. It felt unreal sometimes, like I had stepped into someone else's life, someone who had always been wanted. I was learning to accept it without flinching. One afternoon, I sat in a small meeting room reviewing blueprint notes when my phone buzzed. A number from Ohio. I let it ring. It buzzed again, then again. I turned it face down on the table. 10 minutes later, it vibrated a fourth time. A text arrived. "Lucas, it is important. Please answer." I powered the phone off and slipped it into my pocket. My chest tightened, not with fear but with frustration. I had worked so hard not to let my past claw back into my present, but it always found cracks. At the end of the day, Harrison noticed my silence as we rode the elevator down. "Phone trouble?" I nodded. "Him." Harrison exhaled through his nose. "He will not stop until he gets what he wants. People like that never think the consequences apply to them." We stepped out into the cold evening air. He placed a steady hand on my shoulder. "You do not need to talk to him. Not now. Not on his terms." We drove home through downtown traffic. Holiday decorations still hung in the streets, but I barely noticed them. The weight of the missed calls sat in my mind like stones. The next morning, I turned my phone back on. New voicemail. New text. Then another. Then one from a number I did not recognize. I listened to none of them. I deleted them one by one. That afternoon, after a site visit where I spent most of my time distracted, Harrison walked up beside me near the truck. He looked out at the steel beams rising against the winter sky. "You know," he said, "your father's life was built on the wrong foundation. Lies, fear, ego. Nothing built on that stays standing." I nodded slowly. "I guess I keep waiting for the collapse to pull me down with it. But it will not," he said. "Not unless you let it." Back at the house, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. The heat seeped into my palms, but not enough to quiet my thoughts. I had avoided dealing with my father for years, and it had almost worked. Now he was circling again, circling like he could pull me back if he got close enough. I opened my laptop instead and began looking up college programs. Engineering, architecture, project management. all the paths that had once seemed unreachable. My heart calmed a little as I read course descriptions and program lengths. Each line felt like a small doorway into a future that belonged to me. As I scrolled, a new message popped up on my phone, this time from a name I had not expected. Ben. I stared at the screen before opening it. Lucas, it is me. Can we talk? Please, I need your help. My stomach tightened. I read it twice, then 3 times. I had not spoken to him in over a year. The last time I saw him, he was bragging about a new car while I stood in the corner at a holiday dinner. Invisible. The message felt unreal. Like a stranger had typed his name. I turned the phone face down again. My hands felt cold. Later that evening, I walked into the living room. Harrison sat near the fireplace, reading. The flames cast a warm glow over the room. I sat across from him, staring at the floor. He waited. He always waited for me to speak first. Ben reached out. I finally said. He asked for help. Harrison set down his book. And what did you feel? I shook my head. I do not know. Confusion? Anger? Maybe something like pity. But I do not want to get pulled back into that house, into their problems. Harrison's voice was calm. You do not owe your brother a rescue. He benefited from your suffering. He played a part in keeping you small. If he wants to change, he has to learn how the world works, not rely on you to fix what your father broke. I nodded, but something still twisted in my chest. Maybe it was old instinct. Maybe it was the memory of being children before everything hardened. Maybe it was a part of me that still wished we had grown up differently. Before bed, I checked the message again. Ben had sent another line. Please, I do not know who else to talk to. I turned off the phone without replying. 3 days passed. Work kept me busy. College applications kept me focused. Harrison's steady presence kept me grounded. But the messages kept coming. Not frantic, not manipulative, just persistent. Short check-ins. A few words at a time, like he did not know how to say anything more. On the 4th evening, I walked out onto the back patio. Snow covered the yard. The air was sharp and still. I dialed the number before I could talk myself out of it. Ben answered on the 2nd ring. His voice cracked. Lucas, thank God. I was not sure you would ever call me back. I leaned against the railing, facing the dark yard. What do you want? His breath shook. Things are bad here. Really bad. Dad is out of work. Mom is trying to sell clothes online to cover bills. I lost my job again. They are behind on rent. We might get evicted. He paused. I need advice. That is all. Just advice. The old anger flared hot for a moment. Advice. He wanted advice from the brother he never defended. But I kept my voice steady. Why are you calling me? Why not your dad? He swallowed audibly. Because he is not the same. He is angry all the time. Drunk most nights. He blames everyone but himself. He will not listen to me. He thinks asking for help is weakness. I breathed out slowly. That sounded familiar. You are the only one who ever made things work, he said. The only one who took care of yourself. I thought maybe you could tell me how to start. The words hit me harder than anything he had said so far. I closed my eyes. There was no manipulation in his voice. Just exhaustion. Just a kid who had been handed a life he never learned to manage. I finally said, you start the same way everyone does. You get a job. You keep it. You show up on time. You stop thinking you are owed anything. That is step 1. He sniffed. I know. I messed up. And I do not know how to fix it. You fix it by doing the work. I said, no shortcuts. No leaning on people to save you. There was a long pause. I thought the call had dropped, but then he spoke again. Softer. I understand. Thank you. Even for just talking. I ended the call quietly and stayed outside for a few minutes, letting the cold settle into my lungs. I felt no desire to go back to Ohio, no desire to rescue him or anyone else in that house. But the anger I once held toward him had thinned, leaving something quieter, not forgiveness, just distance. Peaceful distance. When I went back inside, Harrison looked up from the kitchen counter. Everything all right? I nodded. I think so. He studied me for a moment. You made a choice tonight, he said. One that keeps you moving forward. I sat down and let the warmth of the room sink into my bones. Forward. That felt right. But something else lingered too. A feeling I had not expected. A sense that the past was not done with me yet, and I knew it would not stay quiet forever.